Guys, thank you both so much for joining me to discuss the nuances of the queer villain. As I said, we like to frame these screenings in a contextual discussion, and I think we couldn't really avoid talking about one of cinema's biggest tropes when examining the themes surrounding D.E.B.S, and particularly why the queer community have a fondness for them despite a troubled backstory of the trope. So I want to begin by asking you both who you think epitomizes the queer or queer-coded villain, and why it is that they're the first example that comes to mind.
I guess for me it's Lydia Tarr, which is like quite a recent one, but I just think she's brilliant as a character, and like the film is a really like complex film that speaks to a lot of things, but I think as a character she's almost quite simple, which is just she wants to make the best art possible and be surrounded by beautiful things and people, and that's kind of all that matters, and she will do horrible things to do beautiful things in a way, to the extent that almost like when the film finished the first time I saw it, I was like, that's actually really sad that what happened to her happened, even though it was like deserved and justified. But like you're in that moment where you're like, I can sort of see where she's coming from, even though she's behaving horribly, which I think is like the quintessential thing that any good villain, queer or otherwise, would do, which is like make you root for them, even though they're doing things that you might consider horrendous.
Mm-hmm. Cici?
Mine is kind of non-traditional. Mine is Satan. Because I was thinking about this and I was like, oh my god, all the Disney villains are kind of like demonic and satanic, and then I was thinking about like Milton's Paradise Lost and how Satan is this really enigmatic, like seductive figure who you kind of root for because you see that he fell out of ambition and he has this kind of like seductive power when he's a snake, and he kind of doesn't conform to one shape, and when he like is seducing Eve, he's a snake, but he also kind of is jealous of Adam, and there's like this kind of queer dynamic between them. And then it made me think of like Kenneth Anger's films, which are really queer and also consider like satanic occultism as a form of like rethinking queerness, particularly Lucifer Rising, and the one he made about his brother, which I don't remember the name of, but kind of subverting these tropes of like satanism as a form of like queer liberation.
I think it's important that we historically contextualize the term queer coding. As I say, it's got quite a backstory to it, and some people here might be unfamiliar with it. So as a quick summary, queer coding, in particular the queer coded villain, arose from the implementation of the Hays Code in 1933, which was a set of industry guidelines of the self-censorship of content that was applied to most films released by major studios in the US from 1934 to 1968. And it was based on three general principles. Films should not lower the moral standards of those who see it, i.e. they should never sympathize with the side of crime, wrongdoing, evil, or sin. They should depict the correct standards of life, and there should be no ridicule towards the law or creating sympathy for its violation. And though the code didn't explicitly ban things like homosexuality, these things were sort of just largely understood. And films made under the code, the antagonists in these were molded to act as a foil to the heroes of these stories, who most often embodied mainstream and traditional ideas about gender and sexuality. And the more a villain jeopardized heteronormativity, the more evil they were. Queerness wasn't explicit, but rather harmful stereotypes were used to imply that transgressing gender and sexuality norms indicated innate corruption. And this often led to antagonistic or outright villainous characters who could then be read as queer. And this obviously had lasting impact on LGBTQ+ representation, and we still see the effects of those today. But there's also a long history of the community reclaiming these representations. So in the film D.E.B.S, Amy, one of the leads, is taking a class called Capes and Capers, Gender Reconstruction and the Criminal Mastermind. And her essay is on Lucy, who is the main antagonist of the film. And after finding out that she's queer, Amy says that it really torpedoes her thesis. Her general hypothesis is that as a woman operating in a male-dominated field, Lucy felt the need to overcompensate by being exponentially more ruthless and diabolical than her established male counterparts, and that these psychological forces combine to create a kind of emotional void in which she's incapable of loving or being loved. And I think this relates really nicely to what a lot of writers and academics have sort of said about queer villainy, and how one of the most appealing aspects of them is this humanity that is granted by way of giving these characters space to be messy and morally flawed. And I think that's kind of what you were touching upon, Siavash, with Lydia Tarr. Do you agree with this sentiment? And can we perhaps say that queer villains have more agency because not only did they not conform to social hegemony by way of their sexuality, but also their morals?
I guess I'd say, like, I think queer villains do have morals, they're just different morals. And I think that's one of the things that gives us agency. I don't know about them necessarily, but like watching it, you're like, oh, there are different ways of being in this world and presenting yourself. And I think, especially now with like the amount of media that we're exposed to, you've got that level of literacy where you can kind of separate out what the film is telling you to think about this character versus what you might think about the character. And like the example I think of is like, I think almost all Disney villains don't have kids. Like it's a really minor thing, but it's like, that's part of the demonic thing. It's like, oh my God, you're like this old and like you haven't got any kids, you haven't got any family. That's part of what's meant to code them as a villain. Mm-hmm. But actually they're really successful. Like you don't really get like mediocre villains. Like they're all like running this global scheme and like plotting these amazing plans to like destroy Australia or whatever it is. Yeah. So there's a bit of like a sense where it kind of, the film isn't telling you this, but you can read it, which is like, sure, actually, maybe having a traditional nuclear family isn't the only thing that I should want to aspire to, or like what I should frame the value of my like life or livelihood around. Like framing it around your career as a villain also like has its own problems, but like it makes you think there are other ways of like judging your morality, I guess, mm-hmm. which is kind of what the agency stems from.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I was also thinking of that in terms of like women being kind of these cold, calculated characters when they're the villain, and kind of how this ties into like, yeah, the idea of like femme fatales as well in the mm-hmm. Hays Code, and how femme fatales like transgress that boundary between kind of being these female, kind of strong female characters and also being kind of queer. Like Marlene Dietrich and Mae West are like iconic queer symbols, and you know Marlene Dietrich literally kisses a woman in Morocco, and that's, you know, anti-code, and she does it because she cross-dresses as a man, and how she kind of transgresses that boundary, and how even despite like the Hays Code era, mm-hmm. loads of female starlets were like kind of defying it. And also what I find particularly interesting about Dietrich's performance is, you know, she is a sex symbol, and you know Hollywood very much frames her as like the sex symbol for men to look at, but she frames herself in this way, like as you were saying about agency, like she knows she's a sex symbol and she's going to perform the sex symbolism, which kind of makes her take agency of her own self-image.
Mm-hmm. Interesting, yeah. And I think, you know, when we're talking about agency, we're sort of getting also to this topic of liberation through representation. And I think given the historical context of queer liberation, you can't really separate that from crime. And the term be gay, do crime, as we've mentioned, blew up on the internet a few years ago. And Grace also did her incredible season last year. And I think that really embraced this anti-capitalistic and anti-authoritarian ethos, and emphasize that criminality is a means of survival rather than a signifier of being a villain. How do you interpret this term, and how well do you think cinema has sort of balanced the nuance of it in terms of representing queer liberation in film?
I guess like to start with, like it's the context of, you know, especially with older films made anywhere, or like films from a lot of like geographies now, is that being gay is the crime, or like being queer in any way, that kind of. So I think there's that element, which is actually we talk about like, oh, this villain is queer coded and they do this horrible thing. A lot of the films, what they're trying to tell you is this person is the villain because they are queer, and that is their villainy as well. But I think in general, it's also a sense of like, I don't know, I'd say like the stakes matter. So I think with like a villain, it doesn't really matter that much, because you're like, oh, you want to blow up the world, like sure, whatever. Or like you want to like kidnap 101 like puppies, sure, go for it, whatever. That's such a like insane scenario that you almost don't care that much. But I think the kind of criminality, or even like moral question stuff that might not be criminal, that I find more uncomfortable and like less easy to like queer and reclaim, is stuff which is almost like the stakes feel more real. So it's a lot smaller, but you're like, this happens kind of in the film that you're going to watch. I'm not going to say too much, but like that kind of thing about like being into someone that presents as straight, that's not a crime. Like it can feel awful, but it's not a crime. But there's that element of like, oh, actually, I don't really want to see a villain who's queer kind of going after this person that's unattainable, because that's like something that a lot of queer people do experience, or like, and it's something that isn't always comfortable, and like you don't want people to always think that you're like, it's like a more real thing. And it's like, I'd actually rather like have a queer villain that has some like insane plot that has nothing to do with reality, because that's kind of easy to reclaim. Mm-hmm. But when it comes down to smaller, more like concrete things that people can sort of watch and go, oh, I know a queer person who I thought maybe behaved that way towards me or something, that's when it kind of is a bit more problematic. So I almost want the stakes to be like blown up to like really camp proportions, because then it's just fun, really.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think some of like the most queer films are like so out there. Like David Cronenberg is like a queer icon to me, but it's because of the way he frames the human body as this thing that's constantly malleable and changeable and that you can project yourself onto. There's this brilliant new book by 2 trans writers called Corpses, Fools and Monsters, and it kind of details like the trans image throughout cinema. And they write about kind of, you know, how trans films always have this moment of like this mirror reflection moment where like a trans person looks into the mirror and, you know, they see who they want to become, and how this moment is actually like super problematic and problematized, suggesting that there's like a change that has to occur to become trans. And like they relate this instead to like Cronenberg and actually like the idea that, you know, the image can always change and that we're not looking into the mirror but looking into like this continual becoming, which I really like. And I think maybe a new film like I Saw the TV Glow, these are like possibilities to facilitate like queer cinema that's kind of really out there but also like allows us to imagine like otherwise.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And Siavash, it's interesting that you kind of bring the conversation into camp, because, you know, I think some of the most notable cases of queer liberation by way of criminality come from the films of John Waters and actor and drag queen Divine. And I think as well as epitomizing individuality and anarchy and shamelessness, Divine was this leading figure of camp. You know, she embodied the success and theatricality, which were also characteristics that were very common in queer coding, but on a more demure scale, and I feel like that word is ruined now. Wrote the script before that word. Even so, I think like Divine's brand of camp was so influential that it did go on to stylistically influence people like Disney in the post-code era. You know, Ursula in The Little Mermaid is directly based on Divine, and I don't think that's difficult reading. And so Susan Sontag stated that successful camp, even when it reveals self-parody, reeks of self-love. Do you think that we can say that for a villain to be camp is for them to be anarchic simply because it requires that element of embracing shamelessness and rejecting the status quo?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, like in that same essay, what Susan Sontag says is like, the thing about camp is it's not political. And I think like, not just me, because who am I, but like a lot of people have like questioned that and have kind of challenged it and basically said that actually just, even though it's kind of very aesthetic, it's like how you present and how you dress and how you act, that is a very political act because you're positioning yourself in a kind of social code that doesn't accept that, or that kind of judges you a certain way because of the way you look and present visually. So I think, yeah, there's kind of like, sorry to Susan Sontag, but it's almost like the opposite. Like being camp is inherently political, and then it kind of sets you up for that transgression that you'll have in other ways as a character in kind of plot terms.
I think also like being camp, she writes about like life as theatre, and I feel like performativity and like a performance is so important to like queerness and to like gender theory. And I think the idea of like performing extravagance or performing beyond the norm then exposes, you know, the artifice of these boundaries we set ourselves of what the norm is, and it really calls the whole of society into question of what do we limit ourselves by. And I think it's particularly interesting in film because, you know, like we expect a certain narrative structure, we expect a certain film form, but like a lot of queer films really transgress that form and like chop it up, whether it's like through editing or whatever. It's like my favorite films are all really, queer films are all really transgressive in form, like Funeral Parade of Roses by Toshio Matsumoto. It's about these trans women who are like just like anarchic and go around town and are like punks, and they're great, but like the form just is all over the place. They're jumping back and forth across time, like they're having like hat wars and completely irrelevant to the plot. And it's just, I think that's kind of also the aesthetic power of cinema to like represent what it means to be camp.
Yeah, and I think there's a real positivity to camp as well, and you sort of reclaiming it and this queer joy that it helps to ignite. And that certainly comes across in the language that I think the queer community uses when talking about it, that's perhaps somewhat contradictory at times depending on the terminology used and whether we can read that as the reclaiming of certain words. And in the same vein as D.E.B.S stands for discipline, energy, beauty, and strength in the film, I'm going to use charisma, uniqueness, nerve, and talent to refer to something else so we can keep this a little bit PG. So there's a real synergy, I think, between something earning cult status in the queer community and that thing's charisma, uniqueness, nerve, and talent factor. So with that in mind, do you think that the queer community have more of an affinity with a character based on how camp they are and how much they're serving? And why is this an integral part of our enjoyment of them?
I think it comes down to like how you watch the film as much as the content of the film itself. You know, I think like, say a film that gets like mainstream general release, it's on Netflix, that's going to reach audiences who aren't queer. So there's a kind of different burden of representation. So as much as it's like, okay, we can reclaim this for ourselves and we can have like our moment and do this. Not to get into like respectability politics, I don't think it's that, but like there's a sense in which like also this film has to not be just for us. Like the example I give is like It's a Sin that was on Channel 4 that I didn't particularly like. I didn't think it was particularly queer in its form. But I had a lot of like cis het male friends messaging me being like, I did not realise the AIDS crisis was this bad, which is like, sure, you should have done, but like, do you know what? I'm glad that actually maybe the show was made for you. Like it was made to be like aired on TV for a general audience. It has a purpose. I think what really matters is like when it comes to like reclaiming characters or like feeling them and being part of them and like having this connection with them as like queer spaces to watch films, whether that's like you and your mates in your bedroom or like a big screening or festival or party, whatever like the context is. I think that really matters because then you almost like have a permission structure to engage with these characters and these figures in that way, which is great that we're all here.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, I think it's interesting thinking about like marketability and kind of like who is this film actually for and whose cinephilia is this film for, you know? Like I think something that's undeniable about queer cinema is kind of the aesthetic pleasure you derive from it. Like when you think about like new queer cinema and you think about like Greg Araki and you think about, Toshio Matsumoto, there's such a specific aesthetic that accompanies it, which is then so intertwined with its politics, so intertwined with like the filmmaker and their auteurism, and I feel like that's like inseparable from a lot of queer filmmakers I love, and it speaks to the form of cinema being visual. But I completely agree with what you were saying. Like I think, you know, thinking about queer cinema now, like a lot of it is like maybe we have less villains and more complex characters. But I'm wondering if that's always a move towards queer liberation or if it kind of problematizes the kind of way we consume queer culture and whether it becomes like this kind of pink-washed item that's generally acceptable to like a wider range of people. Or I don't know if it has to be a problem, but sometimes it feels like, pink-washing or doesn't feel quite right.
Yeah, I want to sort of put a pin in that thought because I want to explore that a little bit deeper, the sort of how, you know, it's not quite black and white, these representations, and what those representations mean to us as a more modern audience. But sort of refer back to, you know, the why of these characters and what they can sort of personally mean to us. First of all, I think we always have to consider the origins of these queer colloquialisms like serving and mother, and you know, this case, it stems from the ballroom scene pioneered by Black and Latino members of the community in New York. And given that context and the role of the drag mother and mother of the house, do you think that when we refer to characters as such, that sort of stems from a feeling of safety and security that we feel towards them, and perhaps we're able to experience the rejection of these societal norms without fearing direct consequence ourselves?
Yeah, I guess it like goes both ways. It's in that like partly you can relate to them, and I guess particularly historically speaking, you know, during the Code era, is like you wouldn't see queer characters portrayed or queer coded characters portrayed as anything other than villains. So it's kind of like, well, you take what you can get, really. Like you're not going to get a hero tough. Here's what you have, and make the most of it. Find some value in it. Like the cinema is great because it's so more than like contemporary art or theatre. It's really, really popular and accessible, and always has been historically. So you could be someone in like a small town going to see a film, seeing a queer or queer-coded character, finding community through the screen that you wouldn't have at that moment in person. Now, obviously, we're in a slightly different situation. So I think actually one of the great things about it is like, sure, you can relate to characters and you can still continue to have that relationship, and there's no reason not to. Like just because you can have queer communities in person doesn't mean you need to stop like relating and sort of having affinities to queer characters on screen, but I think it can also let you transgress. As like, I would love to behave like Lydia Tarr, like just to like be deep in art and just like try and make the best thing I can and like forget everything else. I'm obviously not going to behave like her in real life because there are other things that matter. But I think there's almost that element of it of like, because they're so camp and they kind of take things to the nth degree, sometimes that's a great way of being like, this person is like me, and sometimes it's a great way of being like, that person actually isn't like me. And it has this cathartic element of like, I'm just going to watch this person go all out, probably crash and burn, but I then kind of like expel that urge from me, and I can like exist in this otherwise like mundane society where we have like rules and values and like we need to look after each other, and I can't be selfish and like horrible. I'll get that urge out. Like that's what catharsis came from. Like Greek theatre was like, watch awful people do awful things, have that urge removed from you, go about and be like good citizens in everyday life. So it kind of still has that purpose now, I guess.
It's interesting because I found Tar really jarring at points. Like I found her really, really difficult. Like there's that moment by the elevator when she is like being rejected by a straight woman, and it feels like then in that moment we see her in this like really pathetic light that I found really jarring, and I found that then it like underscored, like I kind of like felt like her power crumble, not because she was an awful person, but because she was like rejected as a queer like figure, which I was like, no, why are they doing this to her? Like, why is he doing this to her on screen? That I was like, I don't want this reality to kind of seep into her, where I was like, I can't connect with her anymore because she is awful, and then she's also being rejected, and I don't know. I do struggle with queer villainhood sometimes because I think kind of, like it can't fully be removed from the origins of where it came from. Like in Rome Open City, we can see that Ingrid is like closely associated. She's like one of the leaders, and she's a Nazi basically. And then she tries to bring like the girlfriend of the resistance leader onto her side, and she does it by like kind of coaxing her into like a fur coat and like the luxuries of like contemporary life under Nazism, and like she becomes this representation of queerness and also of like fascism, and how those two are so closely tied together in the film as well. And it's like, of course we can reclaim it now with like modern queer directors, but I find that it's like a problematic realm to figure because there's always this history of kind of, what it stood on, that kind of homophobic lens, obviously.
So I guess if we're sort of looking at where we are now and what we're getting out of queer characters, particularly those that are a little bit morally skewed, do we need characters that are more morally skewed rather than those that are outright villainous in terms of what we're after in representation? What do you think is the most impactful to the point where we are now?
I guess like in theory it should get to a point where like there are characters that are villainous or morally skewed that you then relate to, or like whether it's like I kind of like something about them, or just like I wish I could do that. And there are other morally skewed characters where you're like, actually no, that is awful, and you can sort of entertain those different things, and there's enough representation to kind of manage that. I would just say like I find queer heroes really boring. Like I find the hero is always like the least interesting character. Like in Scooby-Doo, if you think of Fred, like no one has any interest in that character. So what I would say is like, let's have more complex, flawed, or villainous queer characters. We don't need as many queer heroes. We don't need a Love Simon. Like it's fine. We can move on from that.
I'm like, let's do queer sci-fi. Let's do queer horror. I'm into like genre cinema as well, in terms of, I think maybe from Hays Code era we had like a lot of genre cinema. We had the noirs, we had the femme fatales, and then now we're moving into a more realist kind of cinema where we're having less of that. But maybe what's fun is having like a spy kind of genre, like can't not think of like Villanelle when thinking of D.E.B.S as well, and maybe that coming out of this like genre history as well. And you know, it allows us maybe more freedom to experiment with the kind of queer characters you have on screen. You can have monsters, you can have vampires, and also thinking about like maybe more like experimental cinema. Like my friend April Lynn curated something for Queer East called Harvesting the Fruits of Monstrosity, and they're all about monsters in queer cinema, but it's like not traditional monsters that kind of made out of AI, they're kind of made out of like digital new media tools, and it's like kind of how can you co-opt new media tool that's been used for like capitalist extractivism to make queer like decolonial cinema. Like I'm interested in kind of, you know, pushing beyond morals to like even like just the wider scope and a wider world. You know?
Yeah, and I guess keeping that in mind, and also, you know, referring back to the way that we do look at someone like Lydia Tarr and we're like, oh, she's mother, or the Babadook, and we're like, yeah, she's mother. Do we think this element of fun is more prevalent now and what's needed, and the role of camp, because we are at a space where we can look towards these representations with more of a lightness? They're not necessarily figures for queer liberation at the point in history that we're in.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, firstly, like, sorry for making this whole panel about Lydia Tarr. Like,
No,
I tend to
that's
do this
fine.
in any conversation, so you've just had to all witness that. Yeah, I mean, I guess, like, liberation in that context is, like, an interesting word, because do we mean, like, political organising? Do we mean advocacy? Because in that sense, these characters haven't necessarily always played that role. It's kind of, you know, like, the reason we have the rights that we have, and, you know, we're still lacking so many others, but the progress we've made is because of real people and, like, organisers and activists and people that have taken risks, and, you know, the punishment isn't like, oh, you're locked up in, like, a dungeon. It's like, no, you're actually, like, ostracised or far worse. So I think there is that element of, like, we can actually have fun with these characters because they've maybe never played that role. I do still think, like, on a personal level of, like, reckoning with your own identity and sexuality and gender, it can never really hurt to have more characters, whether they're explicitly labelled as queer or, like, with a particular label within that or not. It's like, I think it's like an ongoing thing. Like, you know, cruising is, like, always on the horizon. Not cruising, sorry, I'm getting the book and the thing mixed up. There's a book about queer, I'm not just talking about cruising the act, there's a book of queer theory, but, like, queerness is always on the horizon. Like, it's never, so it's like, have more references, have more, like, points of identifying with or against, because it can't hurt. Like, it will just, like, show you more and more, like, what you want to see, even if it's not one specific character or one specific point, even if it's a villain or a hero. Like Cici was saying, like, have more stuff made in more forms that, like, are new and different and, like, unexpected, because you never know. Like, maybe one of those things will speak to you, maybe they won't, but, like, you won't know until it's made and until you've seen it.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. And I think, like, having iconic figures is so important. You know, you want to, as a kid, you want to have a figure you can be like, I want to be like her, I want to be like him. And, you know, I think just, like, future thinking towards, like, the new generation of, like, queer young people, like, this means they have a language to tap into that's, like, accessible to everyone, that they can look for a kind of a mothering figure in, like, this alternate, like, queer family structure. And, you know, it allows modes of thinking about kind of different families and, like, yeah, kind of just restructures our ideas around what a hero can be. Yeah, like what you were saying, like, the utopia is, like, always expanding. And I think, yeah, queer cinema is, like, has always been here. And it's just, like, you're not even just looking in the image, you're, like, looking around the image, like, since the beginning of time, for queer characters who are not even, like, labeled as queer, but like they've always been there. So it's just, like, quite a promising thing to keep looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, speaking of iconic characters, we have some to watch right now. So Cici, Siavash, thank you so much for joining me today to discuss the nuances of the queer villain, and I hope that's given everyone here something to think about as we now enjoy Angela Robinson's incredible sapphic spy rom-com D.E.B.S. But for now, please give it up for Siavash and Cici.